Welcome to It's the Economy. The big economy news came on the weekend. The final budget for 24-25 is going to be presented on July 23rd. Today, we're going to just check out the big revenue and expenditure numbers that we can expect. We already have two economists who have given us their early forecast, and they are our guests. ICRA's Aditi Nayar and Anubhuti Sahay of Standard Chartered Bank. Both say tax revenues and a higher than expected Reserve Bank of India dividend can add over 1.5 trillion to the government's revenues compared to what was assumed in the interim budget. But there are many views on whether the government will spend more and where it will spend. Also, multiple views on whether the government will retain the interim budget fiscal deficit target of 5.1 or whether it will lower it because of the higher than expected revenues. With this preface, let me invite the guests to speak for themselves. Aditi Nayar, Chief Economist, ICRA, and Anubhuti Sahay, Head, India Economic Research, Standard Chartered Bank. Ladies, thank you very much for giving me early reports, actually. Aditi, can you first take me through how much may a government's revenues increase and why? Your numbers.
Thanks, Latha. So the RBI dividend, that number, we've all dissected quite a lot over the last few weeks. We know that that's about 1 trillion higher than what was put into the interim budget. And on the tax side, broadly, what we're looking at is that the gross tax revenues could be around 50,000 crore higher than what was budgeted. Last year's provisional number also ended up being higher than the RE. So the embedded target now is at or below what we expect nominal GDP growth to be. So there is a little bit of scope over there to increase the gross tax revenue number. And of course, a part of that will go to the state government. So we are conservatively estimating that 20,000 crore extra would be left over to Government of India after setting aside the devolution. So 1.2 trillion is the number that we are working with as the revenue upside.
Okay, actually your expectations are running. Gross tax revenues are up almost a 1.2 trillion, isn't it? Compared to, I think it was assumed as 36 trillion, 38.3 trillion, and now you're expecting it could go up to 38.7 trillion. So 40,000 crores more. And part of it comes from direct taxes and part of it comes from indirect taxes. Okay, Anubhuti, what are you assuming? How much more revenues than what was forecast in the interim budget?
Sure, Latha. So I think Aditi has covered it really well. So we do have an estimate of 1.2 trillion of excess dividend flow coming from the RBI. On top of it, we are a little conservative when it comes to excess tax collection at this point in time. So we are just looking at around 10 to 15K of excess tax collection. We have to take into account some of the shortfalls from other non-tax sources and especially from the divestment proceeds. So in our view, while there is an excess of around 1.4 lakh crores taking tax plus the dividend inflow, we will have to take into account a shortfall of at least 20,000 crores from divestment proceeds. Plus, there is also a possibility of, like a 30,000 crores of shortfall coming from the telecom proceeds. The number has been pegged pretty high. So net-net, if we look at it, I think 1 lakh crores of excess on the revenue side is something which we can work around comfortably going forward.
Oh, okay. Aditi, would you want to differ? Because April-May tax collections have been very good. Income tax up by 41.6, as you point out. Of course, corporate tax is taking away the thunder. It's minus 20%. But then you also have some good numbers coming in from CGST. It's, I think, a good 12.2% higher. So what can you reasonably expect? Can the government assume a much higher GTR, gross tax revenue?
There isn't a huge amount of difference between what Anubhuti is saying and what I'm saying. If we really look at the absolute numbers, one of the things that we do need to keep in mind is that in many sectors, the activity did have a temporary slowdown in the month of May in particular while the elections were on. So there would be some impact on the tax collections in a transient manner in the next couple of months as well. So I think looking at a gross tax surplus of about 40,000 crore over what was included in the interim budget. That's kind of a reasonable number. If activity picks up very well in the second half of the year, if the monsoon is great and rural consumption really, kind of comes back with a bang, then there would be a scope for this number to be overshot at the end of the year.
Okay.
But I think at this point in time, may not be very prudent to assume that taxes will overshoot the interim budget estimate by a higher margin.
Okay, no, you're saying about 40,000 crores more than interim budget is, it's not a great deal. And I think that's what Anubhuti is also saying.
As well.
Yeah. And you're also, I mean, if you add the RBI dividend to it, then you're looking at almost 1.5 trillion or a little more than that. Will you also deduct what Anubhuti is saying, like telecom and divestment may have been overestimated?
So, firstly, the tax number that I'm seeing is gross of devolution. So, what will be left over to the government will be a little lower than that. And divestment, the number that they penciled in isn't huge. There is, of course, scope that it would be undershot, but I don't suppose that that number will be changed at this point in time. So, we'll have to wait and see how the year unfolds. Where we expect the budget numbers to differ from the interim budget are mainly these two sources, tax and the RBI dividend, both of which will be to the upside.
Okay, I think the bigger one that people are worried or wondering what the government will do is on the expenditure side. So, Anubhuti, main expectations.
So on a net basis, our sense is, Latha, that we might see expenditure increases. And here I would also include the possibility of tax cut. It's, I mean, you're collecting lesser income tax. So if we put it all together, then our sense is the expenses can go up by around 0.5 to 0.6% of GDP. Here I'm including higher food subsidy bill, which we already know about after the MSP increase announcement came through. The second part would be if the government decides, and these are all big ifs, decides to give some support or increased installment for the farmer loan scheme, plus some tax relief for the middle income segment, and special assistance for state governments, like of Andhra Pradesh and Bihar. So we all put it together, we can see an additional spend of around 0.5 to 0.6% of GDP. Having said that, as we already discussed, there will be extra revenue generation, plus the government has left a decent amount, I think around 0.25% of GDP worth of capex unallocated to schemes. So maybe, all these buffers can be used to offset any increase in expenditure. And to that extent, our sense is that the government will stick to the 5.1% target, at least as of now, and maybe throw in a positive surprise at a later date.
Okay, I spoke to some of the tax experts earlier in one of these run up to the budget interviews. And they said, Mr. Dinesh Kanabar, that if you reduce the income tax, if you increase the income tax limit by 1 lakh rupees, then the total loss for the government is only about 13,800 crores. Doesn't seem like a great deal if even that kind of a giveaway is assumed. And the MSP is not unusually high. It's high only for, I think, sugar. And maybe paddy, if I'm not mistaken. But for a large part, it doesn't seem to be unusually high. Your estimate of likely higher expenses, Aditi?
So, Latha, we are working with, firstly, the assumption that the 70,000 crore that was included in capex but left unallocated will basically get allocated, and the capex number will stay at the interim budget estimate level of 11.1 trillion. Then after that, the revenue upside that I was talking about earlier, broadly we feel that it can be split equally into higher revenue expenditure and or some amount of tax relief. And the other half should be basically used to lower the fiscal deficit number. So if we, let's say, spend 50 to 60,000 crore extra on revenue expenditure, either on new or existing schemes, because, new schemes take a long time to operationalize. So if you really want to very quickly move towards supporting the rural economy, it would be easier to do that through the existing schemes where the structure is already in place. And then the balance we use to reduce the fiscal deficit to about 4.9 to 5.1 to 5% of GDP.
Yeah.
And with that, there is some scope then to reduce the borrowings in the second half of the year.
Okay, so your bet is 5% fiscal deficit, right?
That's right.
Okay, Anubhuti, out of time, what's your best guess of fiscal deficit?
5.1%, Latha. I think
Okay, so
we
they
still
will.
need to know the special assistance package size, and that
Fair
on
enough.
its own can limit the reduction in the budget itself.
Okay. Ladies, out of time, but thank you very much for giving us the broad numbers. About 1.5 trillion more is what the government may get in terms of overall revenues. Tax revenues itself will have to be shared, and therefore they may be able to incur revenue expenses, welfare expenses, maybe even a small tax cut, and yet retain the budget deficit at 5 or 5.1%. That's the best guess from the economists. First cut, we will of course get more numbers as we get closer to the budget. Wrap up on Bazaar Chartbusters.